Before I start this podcast, before I assume today is over, and before I decide that I'm just off for some reason that I quite can't explain, I need to check something. Where is Mercury right now? Because if Mercury is in retrograde, then communication gets weird, technology stops cooperating, my emotions feel louder than usual, and if anything goes wrong today, it's not because I forgot to double check something. It's because of a small planet very close to the sun. And honestly, that's comforting because that doesn't mean I messed up. It means the planet did. So good effort. We showed up. Mercury did not. And once you know Mercury is in retrograde, everything starts making sense in a very convenient way. Your email comes across wrong? Retrograde. Your Wi-Fi cuts out at the worst possible moment? Retrograde. Your pants get stuck on the doorknob as you walk out? Absolute retrograde. And then there's always a checklist. Wear turquoise or coral, avoid signing contracts, don't make any big decisions, and definitely don't text your ex. Now, I already know some of my friends are going to give me flack for this episode because we do this. We talk about our zodiac signs. We talk about Mercury in retrograde. We talk about how we're feeling, and honestly, I get why. I was a bartender for a time, and I can tell you without hesitation that when there is a full moon in the sky, people act differently. I mean, our bodies are made up mostly of water, so if the moon can pull the tides in, it's not that wild to wonder if it's doing something to us as well. You don't need a chart for that. You just need to work a shift in Tacoma on the Ave. Also, if you're listening to this the week it comes out, congratulations! Mercury goes into retrograde next week. Welcome to Lies We Bought.
Because they sold it, we bought it.
When people talk about astrology like it's always been this soft, floaty personality thing, that's modern rewrite. If you go back far enough, astrology wasn't cute to the fact of saying that your sign would get you out of going to a brunch with some guy named Todd. It was pretty serious. For around 4,000 years ago, the Babylonian people were watching the sky because their lives depended on it. There were no calendars or clocks on the wall, no alarms telling you whether it was time to plant or harvest. If you misjudged a season, you lost food. So the sky became a reference point. The Babylonians tracked planets constantly. They wrote down things on clay tablets. They logged correlations. When this planet showed up, this thing tended to happen. A flood, a drought, some political instability, the kind of events that made or broke entire societies. And that is important to understand who this information was for. It wasn't for everyday people. Every astrology was aimed at kings, leaders, or rulers. The question wasn't, how am I feeling today? It was, are we about to make a decision that could destroy everything? I mean, that's a very different origin story than what we picture now. Then the ideas travel. They move through trade routes, they move through conquests, and eventually they land in Greece, where astrology starts to change shape. Because if you know anything about the Greeks, they don't just observe systems, they kind of put them on trial. They take sky-based reference systems and start assigning meaning. So then Mars becomes associated with conflict, Venus becomes associated with attraction, and Saturn with limits and hardship. This is the moment that astrology becomes interpretive. And it's also when we start to focus on narrowing it from the nations to the individuals. Then the idea emerges that the sky at the moment you were born matters, that the arrangement of the planets at the exact time might reflect tendencies, not guarantees, not destiny carved in stone, but patterns and themes. It's a compelling idea, the universe leaving a timestamp on you. One of the people who really solidifies this is Claudius Ptolemy. He writes Tetrabiblos, which becomes foundational for Western astrology. Now, what's interesting about Ptolemy is that he's not trying to sell mystery. He was trying to impose order because he wanted astrology to feel consistent. This matters because at the time, astrology is taken seriously. It sits right alongside philosophy. At the same time, astrology is developing in India through Jyotisha, which is deeply tied to timing. When you marry, when you hold ceremonies, when you make decisions, that tradition doesn't disappear. In fact, they still very much use it today around big life events. But as you can see, for most of history, astrology is complex. It involves calculations that require real study and training. The shift happens when astrology enters mass media. In the early 20th century, newspapers realized something very simple. People respond to content that feels personal. So astrologers began to write short horoscopes designed to apply to a large audience all at once. The moment was 1930 when R.H. Naylor writes a horoscope for Princess Margaret that runs in the Sunday Express. Readers love it. I mean, imagine if someone could tell you how your week was going based on the stars in your birthday. You would freaking eat it up like cake. And that's the turning point, because once astrology lives in newspapers, change has to happen. It can't be complex anymore or require math. It has to fit into a small box next to the weather. So the industry simplifies everything down to the sun signs. One piece of a much larger system becomes a whole thing. The simplification isn't an accident, but a design choice. You don't need your birth time anymore. You don't need to understand charts. You just need to know your zodiac. Capricorn, Pisces, Sagittarius, something easy to remember and easy to repeat. By the time astrology reaches apps, push notifications, it's already been reshaped. It's no longer something you study, but something that studies you. Because here is where astrology stops being history and starts being marketing. If you look at astrology through a marketing lens instead of a belief lens, the whole thing starts to make a lot more sense. Because astrology doesn't spread because it convinces people. From marketers' perspective, the problem with astrology is that it's complicated. Traditional astrology requires charts, math, and context, which automatically limits how many people are willing to engage in it. So they had to simplify the system. Not all at once, though, in a gradual way that felt helpful rather than reductive. The sun sign becomes the entry point because it's easy to remember and easy to recognize. You don't have to calculate anything. You don't even have to believe it. You just have to know what bucket you're in. And when someone knows their sign, they carry it with them. They mention it casually. They compare it to other people's signs. It becomes shorthand for personality in the same way that buzzwords become shorthand for ideas. It's a great branding for anyone. And that's why the newspapers were such a perfect distribution channel. They already had trust and routine. The key thing here is that astrology didn't punish disengagement. If a horoscope doesn't resonate, nothing happens. You don't lose anything, you just move on. The low stakes interaction is part of why it scales. Over time, astrology starts borrowing language from whatever cultural space people are already trusting. When advice columns are popular, astrology starts sounding advisory. When wellness culture takes off, astrology leans into reflection and self-awareness. Astrology changes because the environment around it changes. Instead of telling people what to do, astrology focuses on describing the atmosphere they're already living in, which is a very safe place to operate. When the internet shows up, astrology gets easier to access. Charts that once took time can now be generated instantly, and compatibility becomes something you can click instead of calculate. That becomes even more obvious with the apps. Platforms like CoStar and The Pattern are really careful about how they present themselves. They don't show up like a psychic in a strip mall telling your future. They sound more like a friend who texts you out of nowhere and says, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And somehow it nails it. These apps almost never tell you what's going to happen next because that would be too risky. Instead, they tell you what kind of emotional environment you're supposedly living in. Heavy, reflective, tense, open, unsettled. The kinds of words that feel specific without being cornering. If something goes wrong later, the app wasn't wrong, it was just describing the vibe. CoStar became famous for this. It is blunt, sometimes a little aggressive. You open it and it's going to be like, "Today is not about growth." And you're like, "Wow, okay, noted." The Pattern takes a different approach. It's softer, longer, and a little bit more therapeutic. It doesn't talk about the planets much at all. It talks about cycles, patterns, emotional themes. You could read half of it and forget it's an astrology app at all. And that's not accidental. Both apps are designed to feel insightful without being confrontational. They don't push decisions or tell you to quit your job and move across the country. They just describe what you might already be feeling and let you do the rest. From a user experience standpoint, it's incredibly smart because if the app told you to do something concrete and it went badly, you'd blame the app. But when it's just naming a feeling, there's nothing to push back against. You either nod along or you move on. Another thing they do really well is personalization. You put in your birth information, and suddenly the app feels like it knows you. Not actually because it does, but because it has enough data to narrow down the language. The messaging stops sounding generic and they start sounding more familiar. And once something feels familiar, people get attached to it. Notifications play a big role in here as well because they do not arrive randomly. They tend to show up in the early morning or late night when people are already more introspective, which is marketing behavior 101. The app isn't trying to predict your day, it already knows when you're on your phone. And the tone matters too. The app doesn't spend much time explaining themselves, which makes the messaging feel deliberate, even when they're vague. And then there's the premium layer. You can use the app for free, but the deeper insights sit behind a paywall. More context and explanation, which means more reassurance. The closer the content gets to you personally, the more valuable it becomes. That's a familiar structure. Free recognition at the top, paid interpretation underneath. What's interesting is that neither app really needs you to believe that astrology really works. You don't have to think that planets are controlling your life. You just have to feel like the language fits well enough to keep checking. And at that point, the app has already done its job. And that's why people keep opening it, because the language stays flexible. Instead of selling astrology as a one time purchase, it becomes an ongoing service. There's always another update, another notification, another reason to check in. The experience never fully resolves because life doesn't resolve. Social media changed everything as well. Astrology content online doesn't show up like a lecture, it shows up in your feed the same way everything else does. If this video found you, this was meant for you. If you're a fire sign, today might feel off, even when the same video is being shown to hundreds of thousands of people sometimes. It lands like it found the right person. The language is doing most of the work here, people. And from a marketing perspective, it's incredibly effective. There is no resistance to overcome, no belief to secure. The audience decides whether or not it applies. And once they do, the content has already worked. And that brings us to the size of this thing, because astrology is not a niche hobby anymore. It sits inside what is often categorized as a psychic or spiritual service industry, which includes astrology, tarot card reading, numerology, and related digital products. In the United States alone, that industry is commonly estimated at about $2 billion a year. Globally, and depending on what is included, estimates range much higher once apps, subscriptions, and content platforms, and even merchandise are counted. The money doesn't all come from one place. It comes from personal readings that can cost anywhere from under $100 to several $100s per session. It comes from apps that charge a monthly subscription. It comes from media platforms that monetize attention. And it comes from merchandise that turns identity into objects that you put on a shelf. What's notable isn't just the size, but the structure. Astrology doesn't need to promise outcomes or guarantee results, and that is the best part. It will never have to have an endpoint. Eventually, astrology runs into the question it can't avoid. If someone claims to describe personality, explain behavior, or offer insights into people's lives, someone is going to try to test it. Not to be mean about it, just to see what happens when you put it under controlled conditions. In the early 1980s, a physicist named Sean Carlson decides to bring it into one anyways. Carlson isn't skeptical, but plenty of people are skeptical. And what's interesting is how seriously he takes this setup. He didn't design the experiment alone. He worked with professional astrologers and let them help him shape the rules. They agreed on what counts as fair and on what astrology should reasonably be expected to do. So nobody is being tricked here. People came in and they filled out detailed personality assessments, like the kind psychologists actually use. The astrologers are given accurate birth charts tied to those participants. No tricks, missing data, or fake charts involved. Their job is to match the chart with the correct personality profile. If astrology really does describe personality in a consistent way, this is the moment where you'd expect something to show up. And when the final results finally come back, you're kind of at least expecting a moment where you go, oh, interesting. And instead, you are just staring at a page wondering if you missed something. Because when you lined everything up in this experiment, it all lands in the same boring middle. Basically, the results look exactly what you'd expect if people were guessing. What's more interesting than the outcome is what happens next. The astrologers involved didn't try to walk it back. They didn't argue that the test was unfair after the fact. Everyone agreed on the conditions going in and the results as they stood. From a scientific standpoint, that's the answer. Astrology doesn't reliably match birth charts to personality profiles. If this were a different kind of story, that would be the ending. But it isn't. Because outside the lab, astrology keeps doing what it always does. People keep opening the apps, they keep reading the horoscope, and they keep having moments where a line lands a little too close to home. Not once in a while, but often enough for them to notice and keep coming back. So there's a different question on the table. If astrology doesn't perform better than chance under testing, why does it keep feeling accurate to so many people? That question doesn't get answered by astronomy, it gets answered by psychology. And to understand this part, we're going to be pounding some erasers on a chalkboard in 1948. A psychologist named Bertram Fourier gives his students a personality test. Later, he hands each student what he says is a personalized profile based on their results. He asked them to rate 1 out of 5 how accurate the description made them feel. And the ratings are high, like extremely high, 4 out of 5 stars. The students are very pleased with themselves, and then he tells them the truth. Every student received the exact same description. The description was filled with statements that sound specific but aren't. Things about wanting to be liked, about sometimes feeling confident and sometimes feeling doubtful, being social in some settings and reserved in others. The kind of observations that gives your brain plenty of room to say, yep, that's me. When the students believed the description was just written for them, it felt precise, and once they learned it was generic, that sense of accuracy evaporates. This becomes known as the Fourier effect. People tend to see themselves in vague statements when they think that those statements are personal, which is human cognition. Astrology leans into this consistently, often without meaning to. When a horoscope feels accurate, especially if your zodiac is on it, it sticks. This is why astrology survives scientific testing without collapsing. It doesn't rely on concrete predictions. It stays focused on the internal states and broad tendencies. Those are hard to disprove and easy to relate to. Science answers the question of whether astrology works the way it claims to. Psychology answers the question of why it still feels like it does. Once you understand both, astrology stops looking mystical and starts looking carefully constructed, not as a scam, but as a system that learned how people think about themselves and adapt to that reality. And this is where I have to turn the lens back to me. I'm a proud Sagittarius. I know, but I am. I like knowing my sign. I like saying it out loud. I like that Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, and I especially like that Jupiter happens to be the biggest planet in the solar system. When I learned that, I was genuinely excited, not scientifically meaning, just emotionally satisfied. Big planet, big energy. I'll freaking take it. My husband, on the other hand, is a Capricorn, and according to astrology, we are not supposed to work. Capricorn and Sagittarius are allegedly not a great match, which is funny because we absolutely work. We don't just work, we are solid. So, right there, astrology already falls apart a little. And yet, I still like it. I like that I can laugh about compatibility charts while living inside a marriage that contradicts them completely. And recently, I noticed how deep that pull still goes. I just bought a new Hatch machine so I could have calmer mornings, blissful wake ups, and less chaos, which is very aspirational of me. When I was setting it up, I realized that you can choose your zodiac color for the light. You can also choose a zodiac sound. So, of course, I tried it. I tried Capricorn first, and I hated it. So, I switched to Sagittarius, and sweet music to my ears, I will be sleeping through my alarm. Now, here is the most honest question I had with myself in that moment. Do I like Sagittarius setting because it's actually better, or do I like it because it's mine? And if it's mine, does that even matter? Because the experience still improved. My nights didn't become better because Jupiter did something special, or better because the product let me personalize the experience in a way that felt meaningful to me. And that's the thing that astrology is good at. It doesn't need to be correct, it just needs to feel personal. Once something reflects you back to yourself, even loosely, it gets under your skin. You're more generous with it, and you're probably more likely to enjoy it. Astrology gives language to things we already recognize, and marketing understands that deeply. The more personal something feels, the easier it is to sell, especially when that person you're selling it to is yourself. Another lie bought and sold, and now one. Hopefully, you can retire. Next time, we are getting into the industry that somehow convinced you it was solving a personal flaw. Just know the wrinkle cream isn't the issue, the messaging is.